Happy New Year to everyone. I hope that you finished up 2022 with good results. Unfortunately, Loki decided that she didn't want to make a cameo in this intro, so I'll see if I can sneak her into the outro. This vlog's going to be a little bit different than some of the other ones. It's going to be a mixture of some content that was played on the Prime stream and some content that was played with the same people after the stream had ended. We had some big 3-bet pots, some that went our way and some that did not, unfortunately. Overall, I think there's some exciting hands, and I hope that you enjoy. We start off this session with a round of straddles. Dan opens up King-Queen offsuit from the cutoff to $40. We see a flat by Courtney on the button with 9-8 suited, and Richard overcalls in the big blind with Queen-Jack off. I look down at Ace of Spades, 10 of Spades in the straddle. This hand is perfectly reasonable to play multi-way, but I think that I'm often ahead of my opponent's ranges. Dan could definitely have a stronger hand, but he's opening from a later position, so he's going to have a wider range in general. And I think when Courtney and Richard both flat here, they are often not going to have very strong hands, as they would be 3-betting those. So typically I'm going to squeeze here with Ace-10. I size up a little bit larger with multiple players in the pot and being out of position, and I 3-bet to 235. Dan quickly calls with King-Queen offsuit, and Courtney calls behind in position, and we see Richard get rid of his Queen-Jack offsuit. We go to the flop with the pot at $750. The flop is the 7 of hearts, 7 of clubs, 6 of diamonds. I think being out of position here, I'm going to just be checking most of my ace highs. I think it's reasonable to c-bet here at some frequency if I have backdoor draws, but my backdoor straight is very weak and I do not have a backdoor flush, so I think this is going to be a pure check versus multiple opponents. I check and it checks around. I think that when it checks around that my opponents are also going to often have overcards. I think most of the time if my opponents had a overpair that they would be betting here. I could also see some betting from some under pairs or some 6x combos that are just trying to bet as a mixture of value and denial. I'm actually surprised to see Courtney check back here with his specific hand, as I think that his open-ender has a lot of equity. He has a backdoor flush draw in addition to overcards, even if they are weaker. But I think when he is in position, it's fine to try to realize his equity. We go to the turn, and the turn is the Queen of Spades. I could definitely stab here at some frequency. I think that my range consists of a lot of Broadway cards, which this queen hits pretty hard. And I think that I'm going to have a small frequency of overpairs here as well. But facing 2 players, I think I generally still want to be checking my ace high here. I do continue with a check, and action is on Dan. Dan checks back, and at this point I think that Dan most likely has a weaker showdown value hand, something like a weaker pair, or also something like ace high, king high. I would expect Dan to mostly be betting his queen X here when it checks around to him, as he has a strong kicker with his top pair, and I think it's unlikely that Courtney is ahead of him when he checks back on the flop and doesn't 3-bet pre. I think that when I check 2 streets, I'm very unlikely to have a Queen X holding as well, and I would think that he would want to gain some value and a little bit of denial versus hands like my specific hand or something like a pocket pair that could make a set. But he does check back here, and Courtney decides to also check back again. I think generally this is probably a pretty good situation for Courtney to decide to bet once it checks around to him twice. His opponents should be on the weaker sides of their range, and I think that he can take it down often, which is pretty massive when you have 9 high here. We go to the river, and the river is a second queen. In hindsight, I think that I'm supposed to be just pure checking down my hand. My ace high has quite a bit of showdown. I think that it's likely that my opponents have a weaker pair that has now been counterfeited, or something like king high, jack high. I'm now chopping with other ace X, which is fine, although I would have expected to be ahead of them for the most part. In the moment, I decide to rep queen X. I think it's reasonable that I do check some of my queen X on the turn, and I'm mostly pushing out equity from chops and hands like pocket 9s, pocket 8s that decided to check twice, which again, I think that there's very few combos of. When I do bet here, I'm going to be very polarized as my value range is essentially just Queen X. So I decide to bet river here for $500. Dan quickly moves in, and I think I have a pretty easy fold at this point. He has 0 fold equity, and he almost always has a Queen X combo here that decided to check the turn, especially when he is shoving into 2 players. So unfortunately, I start off the session with a pretty poor bluff, and we are down just over $700. The straddles continue. Ruslan opens up Queen Jack suited to $40 from early position. It folds to Richard in the small blind. He flats Queen Jack offsuit, and I think I have a pretty standard call here with 7 of diamonds, 6 of diamonds. I'm essentially in the small blind here, but I'm getting a good price, and I don't expect to be 3-bet too often in this situation. We go to the flop for a pot of $115. The flop is the 10 of diamonds, 3 of clubs, 9 of spades. Ruslan continues here with a c-bet of $70 into $115, and Richard quickly calls. Action is on me, and I think that in this situation I have a very poor gut shot and a backdoor flush draw. Although I have some equity, I think my range versus 2 people is relatively frail here, and I don't think I want to be continuing as a call very often, even for this price. I think if I had a slightly better straight draw or even a better flush draw, I'd prefer to call here a little bit more frequently. Because my hand is pretty frail here, I think that raise is definitely an option. I generally check raise a little bit more frequently with my gut shots that do have the backdoor flush draw, even though this is a weaker one. In this situation, I think that I do have fold equity. I think that Ruslan has been opening a little bit on the wider side and c-betting a little bit aggressively, so I have fold equity against him, and I do not expect Richard to be generally flatting a c-bet here with a player behind with a very strong range, although it's definitely possible. I decide to bump it up to $320. Ruslan thinks for a little bit, and he does call with his open-ender and overcards. Action gets back to Richard, and Richard shoves all in here for approximately $800. I really like the shove by Richard. I think that he does have a lot of fold equity against my aggressive range. He's played with me a lot. He definitely knows that I have bluffs in this situation. And I think the size of the shove is just large enough to have fold equity versus a lot of made hands. And even if he does get called, he has a lot of equity with his open-ender and overcards, and will often make the best hand by the river. I have a pretty easy fold here. I posture for a little bit, but I never really consider calling. I muck my hand, and Ruslan thinks for a little bit and puts the chips in, and we have a 2.2k pot. The run out comes the 3 of spades, 9 of hearts to give both players queen high. Richard disgruntlingly throws up his queen high before seeing that he's chopping with Ruslan, and they split this 2.2k pot. Unfortunately, I contributed quite a bit to this pot, and Richard and Ruslan got max value with their thin value raise of queen high against my 7 high. We see limping from the majority of the table on this hand. It starts off with CB Kid limping ace-9 of hearts in middle position, followed by an overlimp from Dan in the hijack with king-9 of clubs. Courtney calls with 10-6 of hearts on the cutoff, and Richard completes with 7-5 offsuit in the small blind. I look down at king-queen offsuit in the big blind, and this clearly cannot be allowed. I hate multi-way pots, and I hate small pots, so I bump it up to $80. Both Dan and Courtney continue, and we go to the flop with a pot of $270. The flop is the 8 of hearts, king of hearts, queen of clubs. I'm absolutely loving life, flopping 2 pair here, out of position, multi-way on a very wet board. I expect to often get a lot of money in here. Generally, I would size down in multi-way pots, but I think that with this board texture being so wet and being out of position versus 2 players that I think will continue at a relatively high frequency, I want to size up a little bit more. I continue with a bet of 175. Dan quickly calls. I think that Dan is going to be continuing here with the vast majority of his pairs, probably folding some of the under pairs here multi-way with a player behind. I think he's going to continue with both his straight draws and his flush draws. I would expect raises at some frequency with some of these stronger draws. So when he makes the call here, I think he's often on a medium strength flush draw, an open-ender or worse, or a medium strength pair. Courtney calls behind in the cutoff. I think when Courtney calls here, he also has a pretty wide range. I think that he often has a lot of pairs here as well, and there's a lot of flush draws and straight draws that he can have. Courtney likes to play some of the more suited connected variety of hands, so I think he's going to have a couple more flush draws here, as we can see with the 10-6 of hearts. I think pre-flop he got a pretty incredible price to overcall, closing the action in position. I definitely think that Courtney still has some stronger hands here as well. I don't think that Courtney likes to raise a very high frequency, and I think with the size of the pot that he would be able to get his stack in regardless. We go to the turn with the pot at $795, and the turn is the ace of clubs. Obviously, the most notable draw that gets there is going to be Jack 10. I think that it's unlikely that my opponents pick up two pair very often, as I expect both ace king and ace queen to be raising pre-flop and not over limping. It's definitely possible that my opponents have a hand like ace 8. I think that if they do have ace 8, it's often going to be suited though, so they are limited to only two combos of that. I also think that if they are folding pairs on the flop, I think an 8x combo is going to be a much more likely fold, especially the ace 8 not having any backdoor straights or backdoor flushes possible. So overall, I think that the ace of clubs is a pretty good card for me. I think my opponents often pick up a straight draw with one of their pairs, and I think that the ace of hearts is looming out there, and I don't expect a hand like the ace high flush draw to ever fold at this point. Because I think this card is often going to add equity to my opponent's range, I'm going to size up here. I continue here for $420. Action is on Dan. I think Dan has a pretty clear call here. He's definitely behind all of my value, but he has a very strong redraw with the turned nut flush along with his second pair. Dan does make the call, and I think that Courtney has a very difficult decision here. He's getting an incredible price, but we only have one card to come. I think that although Courtney has a straight draw and a flush draw, his straight draw is only a gut shot, which has very little implied odds, as there would be a 4 straight on the board and we are multi-way. And I think that he's often dominated with his flush draw here. Courtney does make the fold, and I think this is a very good disciplined fold by him in this situation. We go to the river, and the river is unfortunately the 10 of spades, putting a 4 straight on the board. Not the card that I wanted to see here when I'm against two opponents. Thankfully, we've narrowed down the field to 1. As far as value hands here that I'm losing to, I think that it's definitely possible that Dan has a hand like ace 10, although I think he raises that pre-flop most of the time. So now the rest of his value range is consisting of Jack X combos that have made a straight. And again, I think some of his stronger Jack X combos are going to be raising pre-flop, stuff like Ace Jack, King Jack, Queen Jack, Jack 10, especially of the suited variety. So I think that diminishes some of his Jack X combos a little bit. I also think that if he has a hand like Jack 10 that he would have been raising on the turn with two players in there and the board being extremely wet. So I think for him to get to the river with a Jack X combo, he pretty much has to have King Jack or Queen Jack. Again, mostly of the offsuit variety, and possibly something like Jack 9 of hearts, Jack 7 of hearts. But I think most of his range here is going to be made up of 2 pair combos. I think he's just as likely to have a hand like King 10 and Queen 10 here, which I can gain value from. I also think that a large portion of his range is going to be something like Ace of Hearts combos, or possibly a hand like he has here, the King 9 of clubs, which picked up a flush draw on the turn. All of which I can bet small against and put him in a tough spot and make him decide if he wants to make the hero call. Ultimately, I do think my hand has enough value here, and I bet for a quarter size with a sizing of 400 into 1600. Dan tanks for a long time and ultimately does make the call with the pair of kings. I show the 2 pair and we scoop this 2.4k pot. We look at our first premium of the night with Queen of Spades, Queen of Clubs. We open it up to $40 under the gun. The Dock of Felt calls with Jack 9 of hearts from early position. Courtney calls in the hijack with 8-5 of hearts. And Richard completes in the straddle with Jack 8 of clubs. And we go to a flop with the pot at $170. The flop is the 2 of diamonds, 3 of clubs, 8 of spades. I definitely can check my hand at some frequency here, but getting value and a little bit of denial goes a long ways multi-way here. I have a very strong holding, and I don't think I need to use a very large size here on this dry texture. I see bet for $60. The dock quickly folds. Courtney calls with his top pair, and Richard calls with his top pair. I think that both players' range here is mostly going to consist of 1 pair combos. I don't think they have too many sets or 2 pair in their range on this type of board texture, and if they do, I would expect a raise at a pretty high frequency on the flop. So I think I have the best hand the vast majority of the time here. We go to the turn with the pot at $350, and the turn is the 4 of clubs. The 4 of clubs is a very interesting card. I think that my opponents could definitely have a hand like ace-5 or 5-6 at some frequency, but I think for the majority of their range, they're going to be picking up a straight draw here and possibly a flush draw. I expect a lot of hands like 8-7 or ace-deuce, ace-3, ace-4, 5-4. So overall, I think this card's a little less scary than it seems on the surface. And just like the flop, I think that my specific hand is going to gain a lot from getting value against those hands that are almost always going to continue, and to continue to deny equity versus the flush draws, straight draws, and 2 pair possibilities. I think if I do get raised at this spot, I have a pretty tough decision, but it's probably often going to be a fold, as I could be drawing dead or be way behind a 2 pair combo. I put a sizable bet of 200 out here into the pot of 350. Action is on Courtney, and I think he's got a pretty interesting spot here with his top pair and open ender. I think he probably has enough showdown and additional equity to mostly want to be calling here, which he does, and action is on Richard. And Richard's kind of in a similar situation as Courtney, where he has a very good draw with his top pair, and he also has a lot of showdown value. Although I think both players have less showdown value when I double barrel here, multi-way. The pot is now $950, and the river is the 7 of clubs, which is an unfortunate card for me. I think that my opponent's range often now becomes 2 pair here, and I think that they often have flushes here, especially when we are still multi-way and we make it here on the river. As we can see, Richard does make the backdoor flush. Richard leads here for a small sizing of $300, and I think that my overpair is just very rarely good here. The Queen of Clubs is definitely a good card to have as I block some of my opponent's value, but I think that most of Richard's range is not going to be containing the Queen of Clubs, as I think a lot of those overcard combos with clubs would have been folding on the flop. And I think with Courtney behind me, that Richard's bet is going to be very geared towards strength. Richard's also in the straddle position, so he's going to be a lot more connected on these type of board textures, where I think he's going to continue pre-flop with a lot of the suited connectors, while I have a lot more of the over pairs and over cards in this situation. Kind of sucks, but I think that queens is going to just be a fold here the vast majority of the time. I do make the fold, and Courtney folds behind, and Richard picks up this 1.3k pot. Pocket queens worked out so well last time, I thought I would try to do it again. Dan opens up 4-3 suited from under the gun to $30, and I decide to bump it up to $90 in the cutoff with Queen of Hearts, Queen of Clubs. Dan thinks for a little bit and decides to continue here with the 4-3 suited. A little wider than I would have expected him to continue versus a 3-bet out of position. I have seen one instance of him earlier tonight defending with a lower suited connector versus a 3-bet, but in the moment I didn't expect to see too many weak suited connectors in his range. We go to the flop with the pot at $190, and the pot is 4-4-6, giving Dan flopped trips. From my point of view, I think that Dan very rarely has a 4 here. I really only expect to see a hand like ace-4 here at any high frequency, and I think that he could have a hand like pocket 6s that are ahead of me, but for the most part I would think that Dan's range primarily consists of overpairs like pocket 7s, pocket 8s, pocket 9s, pocket 10s. Against that range and a overcard range I generally want to be using a larger sizing, so I continue here for 120 into 190. Dan quickly makes the call. We go to the turn with the pot now at $430, and the turn is the 6 of diamonds. This definitely could improve Dan. I think he's going to have some ace-6, 7-6 combos in the moment. Obviously, we see that he can be a little bit wider here than we initially thought. But overall, I don't think that this card is too poor for my entire range. I think that Dan's hands are still going to consist of mostly overpairs and possibly some ace-x combos with backdoor flush draws. And I continue to barrel here for a large sizing with a bet of 275 into 430. Dan thinks for a little bit and makes the raise to 775. I'm in a tricky spot now. I think that Dan could possibly be doing this with overpairs still that are weaker than pocket queens, and he's trying to either gain a little bit of value or denial, especially against my hands like ace king. Although I think he can have some 6x and 4x combos. Like I said, I think that it's a very small portion of his overall range, but at the same time, it's hard for me to think of too many bluffs that he has. If he has a hand like 7-5, he clearly has more 6x and 4x hands. I do think that the only natural bluff here is something like 8-7, but in the moment, I did think that he could be raising with worse value here. And ultimately, I do decide to make this call. And I think when I make this call on the turn, I'm pretty much committing my stack on the river, regardless of what the river card is, when Dan only has a half pot sized bet back. The pot is now 2K, and we go to the river, which is the 3 of clubs, which rarely changes anything. And Dan does decide to shove here, and I quickly flick in the call. He shows the 4-3 suited, and unfortunately we have to muck our pocket queens here, and Dan scoops this 4K pot. And unfortunately, the trend continues of our premium hands losing sizable pots. The table is smaller and the straddles are bigger, as we are now 6-handed, and CB Kid straddles to $40. Richard bumps it up to $125 in the small blind with king queen off, and I have a pretty clear 3-bet against a small blind opening range when I look down at ace of spades, queen of spades. I 3-bet to 375. It folds to CB Kid. He thinks for a little bit and does elect to make the call with half of his stack with Jack 10 offsuit, and Richard calls behind. We are now playing a 1.2K pot. The flop is the 5 of clubs, 5 of hearts, 5 of spades. On this specific board texture, I have an absolute massive range advantage, at least heads up. And it's a board texture that I'm supposed to be c-betting with the majority of my range for large sizing. The specific stack to pot ratio here is very awkward. I don't mind getting it in versus CB Kid regardless of what he has when he only has $400 behind. As we can see, he has quite a wide range here. I'm unsure if I want to use a smaller size when the SPR is essentially 1 versus Richard. I think that my hand has a lot of value here, and due to the massive range and nut advantage, I ultimately decide to just shove all in here. Again, not entirely sure what to do here, but I figure I have decent equity against either of my opponent's ranges, and I'm fine just having them fold out and picking up this 1.2K pot. Thankfully, both of them do fold, and we scoop this pot without too much resistance. This hand occurred immediately after the stream ended. We have an early position limp from CB Kid, and I look down at pocket kings in middle position. I open it up to $25, and we see a 3-bet from Richard in the cutoff. At this point, I'm absolutely loving life, sitting here with pocket kings, and to my satisfaction, CB Kid decides to call the 3-bet. I think at this point, I generally want to be 4-betting my hand. Richard and I are very deep, and I think that he often has a hand that can continue when he 3-bets here. I elect to 4-bet to $300. Richard thinks for a little bit, and he makes the call. Then something surprising happens. CB Kid quickly moves all in for his $550 stack. I can definitely flat my hand at this point, but I think with Richard and I being pretty deep and the shove by CB Kid being probably a little bit on the wider side and for not much more money than my 4-bet, I think that bumping it up again is completely reasonable. I think that Richard has a pretty strong hand at this point when he 3-bets me and calls a 4-bet. I decide to shove all in for the remaining $1,800 effective. Richard thinks for a little bit and then ultimately folds, and we go heads up with CB Kid in a $1,400 pot. The flop is the 9 of clubs, 8 of diamonds, 7 of clubs. The turn is the Jack of hearts, and the river is the 6 of spades. Definitely not one of the runouts that I'm looking to have with pocket kings, as my opponent often has a set here or a straight. And in this case, CB Kid shows his queen 10 off for the nut straight, and we immediately lose this good sized pot off stream. In this hand, we have a $10 straddle. Dan opens middle position to $40. It folds to me, and I look down at ace of diamonds, 5 of diamonds on the button. I think that this is a perfectly reasonable hand to call, but if you've watched any of my earlier vlogs, you know that this is one of my favorite combos to 3-bet. I bump it up to $140. It folds around to Dan, and he makes the call. I think that Dan has a little bit wider range than most people in this spot. I think that he often likes to defend some of the suited connected cards, hands that have a potential to crack my strong overpairs. We go to the flop with the pot at $290. The flop is the absolute gorgeous 10 of hearts, 5 of clubs, 5 of spades. Absolutely loving life, flopping trips here. It checks to me, and I'm going to bet about 60% pot. So I use a size of $165, expecting to get called by, at the very least, all of Dan's pocket pairs, his 10x, and the remaining 5x in the deck. I think that Dan would be continuing here with a lot of his overcards and double backdoors, hands like king of hearts, jack of hearts, hands like ace of clubs, queen of clubs, that can pick up a lot of equity on the turn or hit a pair. Dan does elect to make the call, and we go to the turn with the pot at $620. The turn is the 7 of clubs. It checks to me, and I think at this point I want to continue to barrel. My hand is obviously very strong and slightly disguised. I think that the 7 of clubs is a relatively blank card. Obviously Dan could have a hand like pocket sevens, but I think a lot of his continues on the flop are picking up a flush draw. I continue here for a size of 450, about 75% pot, slightly bigger than I would normally be going here probably, but Dan and I are very deep, and like I said, I think I have a very strong holding here that merits a large sizing on a relatively blank turn card. Dan quickly raises to $1,200. I think that Dan is doing this with some of his combo draws. So if he did continue with something like 9-8 of clubs on the flop, I think that he has some flush draws and overcards, hands like ace queen, ace jack, queen jack, etc. I definitely think that he can do this at some frequency with a 10. I think that he can definitely have some overpairs, and then due to the range that I think Dan is calling pre-flop, I think that he definitely has some 5x combos here. It's definitely reasonable for me just to call here. I think that generally with this stack to pot ratio though, I probably want to play my hand as a raise. I want to maximize the value I get against his flush draws, as they aren't guaranteed to put in money on the river if the flush doesn't complete, and his hands like overpairs and 10x can definitely slow down on scare cards, whether that's an overcard or a flush completer. So I decide to shove here for my remaining $2,195. Dan tanks for a while and ultimately does make the call, and we're playing a 5K pot. The river is the dreaded 10 of diamonds. We show our ace 5, and thankfully the 10 of diamonds does not improve Dan to a higher full house, and we scoop this 5K pot. It looks like we saved all of our premiums for after the stream, as I am dealt pocket aces in the big blind. Dan opens the button to $20, and I have a clear 3-bet here. Think that anywhere from 4 to 5x is going to be the preferred sizing out of position. I think that when Dan and I are both deeper, I'm generally going to want to be going towards a larger size. So I bump it up to $100, and Dan makes the call. We go to the flop with the pot at $210. The flop is the king of clubs, queen of diamonds, jack of diamonds. Not the board texture I really want to see with pocket aces, no diamond. This board texture, although very favorable for my range in general, is also going to hit Dan's range pretty hard. I think that he could easily have a lot of 2-pair combos here and some straights. And I think that a hand like pocket aces wants to pot control at some frequency. Aces makes a wonderful bluff catcher, often even gaining value from hands that my opponent thinks that they are value betting, like King 10. I do decide to check to pot control here. Dan thinks for a little bit and he throws out a bet of $100. Dan can still have a lot of the 2-pair combos and some straights here, but I think that he would be continuing here with a lot of his King X combos, probably some Queen and Jack X combos, especially if they have a straight draw. And I'd be expecting him to bet here with a small frequency of his under pairs after I check this flop and show a little bit of weakness. He can also clearly have a lot of flush draws and straight draws on this board. And I think at this point, my hand is a pretty pure call here. I think that when I raise, I'm going to be often getting called by better hands, or at least bloating the pot versus hands that have a ton of equity versus me. I do make the call, and we go to the flop with the pot at $410. The turn is the 5 of hearts, which really shouldn't improve either one of our ranges. I think that there's a small frequency of pocket 5s in Dan's range, and I think that he could definitely have a hand like 6-5 of diamonds that now has showdown, but generally the 5 is not going to change much here. I check and Dan elects to check back. I think that when Dan checks back here, he often does not have any of the 2-pair or straight combos. I think that at best at this point he probably has a King X combo, possibly King 10, but more likely something like King 9 or King 8. I think that it's still possible that he has a hand like Queen 10, Queen 9, Jack 10, some of these middling pairs with a draw that now want to go into a more pot controlling line after I've called the flop bet. We go to the river, which is the 7 of hearts. I think at this point I have a very clear value bet with aces. My hand is pretty disguised, and like I said, I do not think that Dan has a lot of these 2-pair combos or better, and I think that I'll have to be called very frequently by almost all of his King X combos if I put a bet out here, and I expect some hero calls with some of his Queen and Jack X combos. I decide to go large as I think my hand is worth a ton of value here, and I go about 75% pot with a bet of $300. Dan thinks for a little bit and he does make the call. We show the pocket aces and he says nice hand, and we scoop this 1K pot. In the final hand of the night, we see a limp by CB Kid in middle position. I open up Ace King offsuit to $50 on the button. Richard makes the call in the big blind and CB Kid overcalls, and we go to the flop with a pot of $170. The flop is the Ace of Hearts, 8 of Spades, 7 of Spades. It checks to me. I think I have a pretty clear value bet here most of the time for a smaller sizing generally. I definitely could bump up my sizing a little bit more with this board texture being on the wetter side, but generally ace high boards I don't want to use massive sizes. My specific hand is going to lean towards betting more often as I have a very strong top pair and I do not have a spade here, so my opponents have a continuing range that I'm ahead of much more often. I c-bet for a size of $50 and we see a call from both Richard and CB Kid. At this point, Richard calls for a 10 on the turn, and the miraculous 10 of diamonds does come on the turn. The pot is $320 and Richard decides to lead out here for $125 after calling his card. I think I have a pretty clear call here. I think that Richard's range on the flop is going to consist of a lot of ace-x combos. I think he's going to have some spade draws. I think that it's mostly going to be straight draws like Jack 10 and 10-9, which are suited and connected, and he could have made a pair here on the turn. And I think that this card could definitely improve him to 2-pair at some frequency, stuff like ace 10 and 10-8 suited. He also definitely could have picked up a flush draw and a pair here, and then he has a low frequency of Jack 9 suited as well. Against that range, I think I have a pretty clear call. I'm still ahead of a lot of his bluffs. I have equity versus some of his made hands, and there's always a chance that he has a worse made hand than me, being either a worse top pair combo or a combo draw with a pair. We go to the river with the pot at $570, and the river is the King of Hearts. Richard continues his story by betting 300 into 570, so just over half pot. I think that my specific hand is going to merit a raise at a high frequency. I'm now ahead of a large portion of his value range here, being hands like ace 8, ace 7, ace 10, 10 8, and I think that it's always possible he has a hand like king 10 of spades as well. I would expect that most of Richard's pocket 10 combos are going to be 3-betting pre-flop, so the only sets I really expect him to have in this situation at some frequency is pocket 8s and pocket 7s. Occasionally I lose to a straight here as well. He's got some jack 9 suited combos and queen jack of spades. I don't think other queen jack combos would be continuing on the flop multi-way. But overall against that range, I think that I have a pretty clear value bet. I bump it up to 800 and Richard quickly calls. And unfortunately, he flips over the jack 9 of clubs for the turn straight. So he really meant it when he was calling for that 10. And unfortunately, the river improved my hand considerably. And we lose a 1.7k pot to end the session. I appreciate Richard not re-raising here on the river. I think that I definitely could have some queen jack combos in my range. I think that ace king is probably often going to be a call in theory facing a re-raise here, but against general population, I don't think most people are 3-bet bluffing, especially on the river. I think I would have folded here on the river, so I think that Richard did get max value against my specific holding. With just a small exchange of treats, Loki was kind enough to join us for the outro today. Couple rough hands that session, but thankfully the ace-5 made enough profit to make up for all the other losses. So overall I profited $533 this session. Again, I want to thank everyone for tuning in. This channel's grown a lot more than I expected this year. I've had a lot of fun recording these vlogs for you guys, and I hope that I continue to push out more content that you guys enjoy.